All right, thanks everybody. I'm really pleased to be here and just acknowledging that I'm joining you here and glad to be welcomed on the lands of the traditional Treaty 1 First Nations people here, and in particular the heart of the Métis Nation homelands. And so just grateful to be gathered here. And so I'm going to be talking today about the National Adaptation Strategy and considerations for the prairies. And I thought I had like an hour for this presentation. I was saying that to Kara earlier. So if I talk quickly, it's because I have a lot of material, but I'll try and give a bit of an overview of the National Adaptation Strategy and the related implementation plans related to it, because it's a whole of society effort. And so hopefully many of you will see yourselves in it or will be part of the work and implementation that we're doing. So to start, just what is the National Adaptation Strategy? It's a commitment from the Government of Canada to develop this. Canada is one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have a national adaptation strategy. Most other countries do, and they're a way to reflect and encompass the work that's happening across the country and look at national goals and priorities. So with this National Adaptation Strategy, Canada will be coming in line with its peers and have a whole of society approach that reflects all of the different work that's happening across the country. Also looking at best practices internationally, one of the design features that we've worked into it is, you see the cycle on the slide, is a cyclical approach with monitoring and evaluation so that we can track our progress over time. On adaptation, this is one of the trickiest things for those of you working in the field, this ability to track progress and understand if we're resilient as a result of our efforts. One of the trickiest bits, but we're going to try it as part of the strategy. So you'll see elements of that. And then we'll have priority actions that will be implemented with partners. And just to give a snapshot, just where this initiative is at, I'm explaining at a high level, but it's a draft strategy was released in the fall, and we're in a final comment period with the provinces and territories and Indigenous partners. And spoiler alert, I'm not here to convey a date for when it's going to be released. Many people may be asking us, is she going to say? Nope, I'm not. So that's the National Adaptation Strategy. A couple of features about it is we have outlined 5 different interconnected systems of work, looking at thriving natural and biodiversity system, disaster resilience, strong economy and workers, resilient infrastructure, and health and well-being. And one of the first things you do is you put everything in buckets as an organizing framework, and then you discover that they're all really connected. So you will see little pieces that show the interconnectedness of the different systems, and we're calling them systems on purpose. So buckets of different action or systems and an overarching vision. And then one of the pieces that I really find important to highlight, and I mentioned that Canada catching up a little bit and developing an adaptation strategy, but one of the features that we have are a set of guiding principles. And this really reflects that it's not just what you're going to do under a strategy, but it's also how you're going to do it. And so through the experience of COVID, or through the experience that we've seen with disproportionate impacts or different communities that are more vulnerable, it is important to look at those equity rights, uphold Indigenous rights as part of the way you're going to implement your strategy. So big component of it, respecting jurisdiction also are important things. And in the Canadian context, where a lot of that is quite relevant. So those guiding principles are something important to highlight in the way we implement. Structure and overall approach. So this diagram just shows the structure of the National Adaptation Strategy: vision, goals, objectives, targets. Mentioned again, Canada is catching up, but this idea of having targets, usually other countries are maybe on their 3rd or 4th iteration of their plan before they attempt targets, and we're going to go for it in our very first one. So this is another one where the ambition is there from the government, and a lot of challenges with this area as well. It's not like in greenhouse gas mitigation, where you have a unifying framework of you're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or in conservation, and where you're trying to protect a certain percentage of land mass. It's difficult to measure progress in what are you trying to achieve in each of the different areas. So this is an area that we're trying to experiment with, and I think is an important feature of the plan, but it's definitely, again, another one of the challenging ones, but it's a really important part of the ambition. So we're glad it's included. And then the bottom of the pyramid, I'll go through this in more detail, but the action plans and the way that we would implement the strategy. So it's developed with key partners, and I won't go into detail on this. It's been about 2 years that we've been on the journey, developing the adaptation strategy, working with provinces and territories who themselves have their own adaptation plans and strategies in many cases, working with Indigenous partners, again, many cases having plans and strategies in development or priorities in development. We had different expert advisory tables, different bilateral mechanisms with Indigenous partners. We have joint tables that are set up to discuss climate change. We're part of the expert advisory tables that we had, and experts and key stakeholders, as I mentioned, involved in each of the 5 areas of the NASA systems that I mentioned. And I see lots of faces around the room of people who are involved in those tables. And I'm conscious that some people have the document probably almost as well memorized as I do in the room. So appreciate all the feedback and input from people who were with us along that journey in whichever way that it went. And federally in particular too, it was quite horizontal. So in the federal system, we had federal partners leading each of those different system areas. And then we would have an external person when it came to the advisory tables. And then when we were working federally, we would work through FedProv territorial tables. So if it was health or forestry, working through those. So really quite horizontal, I guess would be the key message that I would say in designing the strategy. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order in my slides now. There. So I mentioned about it being developed with key partners, and then I want to move into the implementation stage. So we're in the final comment period, collecting all the final input, hoping to be releasing the documents soon. And everyone is kind of focused on, okay, strategy is good, let's move into implementation. So we're already really seeing that interest to move into the implementation side of things. So the reason I went out of order is because this slide kind of maps out the 3 different elements of implementation. So the Government of Canada Action Plan, this is the federal contribution to the National Adaptation Strategy. So as we were developing the strategy, we wanted to make sure that there was a distinction between the national strategy, which we hope many people see themselves in, and that we would be developing and implementing with partners. And people saw it as a partnership, that was separate. And so then we wanted to have a federal contribution. What will the federal government do? So the Government of Canada Action Plan is the federal document outlining the details of what we would be doing. And I'll go backwards, and so I'll share a few more slides on that. In an Indigenous context, as again, I mentioned, Indigenous partners have plans and strategies in some cases and are incredibly interested in this space because climate impacts are often disproportionately affecting Indigenous communities. So this element is tremendously important. And so the implementation mechanism, while we have plans and strategies, we have programs, and those programs need to continue and be strengthened. An Indigenous climate leadership initiative is being developed and committed by the government, and working in partnership to co-develop what that looks like. So the mechanisms, the way that we work together. And again, I have another slide on that, but that's the implementation mechanism that we picture there. And then the last one is the FPT bilateral action plans. So these would be, and again, provinces and territories have their own plans and strategies in many cases. So these action plans would be areas of cooperation between the provinces and territories. Looking at possibly, I just was in Baffin Island and Iqaluit last week, and I think looking at a different approach in the north. The context there is specific and different, I think. And we'll look at these bilateral action plans being unique in each jurisdiction based on priorities in those areas, state of readiness, how we want to cooperate. So those will be developed in a bilateral way. So this slide just kind of outlines the implementing mechanisms, and I'll just go backwards now to go through each of them in a little more detail. So the Government of Canada Action Plan. So this was also released in November at the same time we were releasing the draft National Adaptation Strategy. So the idea was we're showing progress on the strategy, but wanted to show some momentum for what the federal government was doing and our contributions. So that was released at that time. It wasn't released for comment per se, although we are getting comments and we're getting good feedback. So we're going to make some adjustments. But as part of that, there was 1.6 billion in new measures and investments as part of that. And so some of them are highlighted here in terms of Green Municipal Fund, topping up the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. Have a slide that goes in more detail. But so it was important to have some investments that were new investments coming alongside this. But actually, and it sounds a little bit nerdy to say, I always say, but this action plan, it was the first time that we actually inventoried all of the federal measures. So we hadn't done that before. There's lots of people working on adaptation, and we had coordinated efforts and committees and things, but we never really put it all together in a package. And so this was our first time to actually inventory all of those measures, outline roles and responsibilities. So NRCan, what do you do? ECC, what do you do? PCO, what do you do? And outline what those roles and responsibilities are for each of us in the federal family. And by the time we were done tallying it up, it was about 68 measures across 22 departments and agencies, long annexes about those roles and responsibilities and all the programs and initiatives. So it's not the most exciting document to read, but it is one of the first comprehensive tallies of what all the federal government is doing. And again, highlighting some of those measures that have been implemented alongside the National Adaptation Strategy, and we'll be updating it to reflect new funding in the new budget, and also outlining directions that the federal government may be looking towards or taking in a sort of future action section of the document. Federal role is outlined in the document. I come back to that point. We had not articulated the federal role in adaptation since the decade. So we had a federal adaptation policy framework, but a lot had changed, a lot more action, a lot more work on codes and standards and things like that. So updating of what the federal role involved was also an important part of this. So talking about context and opportunities in the prairies, here is a summary of the new federal funding and investments that were part of the strategy. On the top left, I'm happy to say that we got some policy funding for my team. So it's some of the first dedicated policy funding for adaptation. And that also probably doesn't sound entirely glamorous, but it's a strong commitment to adaptation as a profile. I see Elaine is smiling because we don't get a lot of capacity funding. So it's a strong vote of confidence of the importance of adaptation as a file, having dedicated people working on it. And so as an indicator, we're taking that as a really positive one. Next one under that is priority climate data, services and assessments. Heather is leading the charge on that one, along with others. And ECCC. I won't go through all of them, but some important ones there. So another one I would draw attention to is local leadership for climate adaptation. So this is under the Green Municipal Fund, and there had been under FCM ways that adaptation could be funded, but it was never really part of the Green Municipal Fund. And so now it will be, and a significant amount of funding there, 530 million. And so this will be for dedicated adaptation projects and measures. And hopefully in the way that it's designed will be kind of elegantly designed, building on the lessons learned and what we've heard is needed. So the ability to design and develop programs and proposals, have capacity, and to be implementing those proposals. So kind of the full value chain there. So I think that one's going to be an important one and a good opportunity across the prairies for municipalities who need action. In particular, the focus and part of the reason that the government looked at the Green Municipal Fund is there are the big infrastructure funding programs, and those are successful. They're moving big projects, but they're not necessarily getting at some of the smaller municipalities or northern contexts. So this Green Municipal Fund, we hope will kind of fill in that gap a little bit more to get at some of the smaller rural communities. So I draw attention to that one. Disaster resilience, flood mapping programs, and you can see in the bottom bar that we also got new funding in budget 2023. So when we update the document, we'll be updating with measures that were funded in budget 2023. So flood, and then more flood programming in the recent budget, wildfire measures, and health and well-being, extreme heat. I think heat is becoming increasingly an issue that we're all focused on. And so important to have new investments in that area, health system measures, suite of measures in infrastructure. And I think in the prairie context, looking at the things like the climate toolkits, where some of the colleagues who are working in the infrastructure space have worked in federal government on the adaptation side or in the provincial government on the adaptation side, and look at where some of the roadblocks can be for the uptake on infrastructure projects. This climate toolkits initiative will be helping to walk communities through the process to have the tools and things that they need to help access that infrastructure funding. And that, alongside climate services organizations, I think is going to increase the ecosystem of people being able to access that funding. And economies and workers. So there's a coastal communities program. That one's led by Natural Resources Canada. And then the two I haven't mentioned yet in the budget. So I mentioned flood, and then there's the Canada Water Agency being hosted in the prairies, and hydrometeorological funding. So this is supercomputing funding that will help us with our prediction capabilities and such. So this is a federal new investments. And so in the Government of Canada Action Plan, all of the federal funding initiatives are listed there. These new initiatives are listed, and this document will be updated, including any new funding proposals or activities that are that folks would be eligible for. Now I'm going to go through PT bilateral action plan. So I won't go into too much detail on this one, except to say that we hope to work with the provinces and territories who want to finalize the National Adaptation Strategy, because it's still in the comment period, so not get too far ahead of ourselves. So we picture this work actually in earnest happening in the fall, and working at the pace and scale of each PT and how they're ready to partner. They're not proposed as, or not currently proposed as funding agreements. We're picturing a little more of a matchmaking effort to start with. So there are federal programs and measures that can be funding activities. And so looking at where the priorities are in the provinces and territories and map that to where the federal government has policies and measures, identify where there's gaps, and then take it from there. So that's our plan on that. And hopefully we can work together with the provinces and territories to identify those collaborative opportunities. So each of us staying in the lane as we need to, or respecting jurisdiction, but bring more cooperation and collaboration in our priority areas. Indigenous climate leadership is a little bit different than the PT bilateral action plans. In some ways, actually, I think the Indigenous climate leadership is a step ahead. The work that we're looking at here is progressively vesting the interests in the hands of the Indigenous partners to say, what are your priorities, self-determined on a distinctions basis on climate change, and looking at ways that we can transfer responsibility and leadership and self-determination into the hands of Indigenous partners. And this discussion has kind of been taking place through joint tables that were started back when we started the Pan-Canadian Framework, which was a government-to-government initiative, but didn't include Indigenous partners as much. And so federal tables were set up, or Canada tables were set up with Indigenous partners. And I think this is a really exciting area of work. And so looking at how this is going to roll out and be an exciting new chapter, I think, in the relationship on climate change with Indigenous partners. Timeframe for this is also a couple of years out, so development and design phase, same as it will be with the PTs. So active discussions and engagement taking place. It's CERNAC and ECCC who are leading on this effort. And then implementation with key stakeholders. And so then I hope most of you see yourselves somewhere on this slide in terms of where you are and are represented. And I would mention, because there's not a mention on the slide, but we've been having meetings with the regional climate services organizations over the last couple of days. And so I just do want to underscore that I think we view the regional climate organizations as really central in the adaptation ecosystem. I think as there's more and more national policies that are coming down, funding programs federally that say you need to factor in climate change adaptation, provincial and territorial strategies that talk about adaptation, funding opportunities that say you need to look at climate impacts, those regional climate services organizations will be best friends to help walk you through what that looks like. And adaptation by definition is local and regional. And so I'm not going to sit in Ottawa and say, here's how you need to adapt, but a regional climate services organization will know more about what that regional and local context is. So I think incredibly powerful partners. So that's my infomercial for all the colleagues that we've been having the pleasure to meet with over the last couple of days. Others, and again, local and regional governments, a lot of the adaptation work is happening at that local scale. Private sector has been really involved in the National Adaptation Strategy. Great partners bringing ideas, challenging us for ambition, pushing us to take action. And I contrast this to some of the work that other environmentalists do, where this is probably the opposite. And so it's really been a great partnership where we've had, the insurance industry, the engineers, the accountants, different professions who are excited. They want to take this work. They see the importance of it. They see themselves in it, and they're pushing for action. And so that's a nice space to be in, actually. So a special shout out, I think, to some of the private sector partners who have worked with us along the way. Academic institutions, think tanks, non-government organizations, through the expert advisory tables. We had a lot of people mobilized through this process, and the kind of research that Ryan presented feeding into the work that we were thinking of. So it was getting to be quite a rich ecosystem of people who are feeding in and having views and participating as part of the process. And I think that's only going to be continuing as we move forward into implementation. And communities and individuals. And we were talking just before the break about youth, and that has been definitely underscored through our work, is that youth are really interested to be involved, want to be involved, see this as their future. And it's an important space. And we've done some engagement in this area, but I think as we move into implementation, there's a real keenness to be involved and shape how things work. So this is the big non-reveal slide of timelines. So it shows the journey that we've been on. So the NAS and the GoCap was released. I was saying to Chris at lunch that the quieter that we appear publicly is like the more busy that we are internally. So you probably haven't seen or heard much from us because it's the scramble of the duck paddling under the surface. So a lot of work taking place to incorporate that feedback and input into the document. And so we released it, and then we've been doing the different engagement that we have with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation partners, different work with the provinces and territories. We had the budget, and so we want to reflect that in our documents. The end of the comment period took place, and we will be releasing the final NAS. Hopefully we'll be taking summer vacation. That's my only thing I'm going to say. So that's where we're at in the next steps. And I'm happy to take any questions. I have just one final slide that I wanted to mention. And Alain Bork is here. So if you have any comments or questions, you can talk to me or Alain. But we're really, really excited. There is the National Adaptation Strategy process has been consuming for a lot of us, but there is actually even more exciting news on the way. That is the Adaptation Futures Conference. And so this is the world's largest conference on adaptation, and we're going to be hosting it in Canada, in Montreal in the fall. And so this is really terrific. Registration is open, and I think some of us were getting good news last week if we got our sessions accepted. So this is all good news as well. So I'd really encourage people to take a look at this because it's going to be a great event. Alain and his team are just doing an amazing job, and it's going to be in Montreal in the fall and welcoming the world to Canada on adaptation. So hope you can take a look at that as well. Thanks.
Any questions for Lanielle? We have time for one or two. Questions for Lanielle from the room? Okay, yeah, here, I'll give you the mic. You want to just introduce yourself?
Hi, Evan Graham, Manitoba EMO. I was just curious, in the last conversation, we had a lot of talk about the newest generations and how they feel about climate change. And I have friends who have no idea the National Adaptation Strategy is a thing. And this is a really heartwarming, like good first step of good action. So what's the plan to tell all the Canadians that don't know about this or not in this about this plan in this concise manner?
Yeah, I love your question, first of all. So thank you for that. Yeah, after the cost of climate change, I thought, well, I hope my presentation is hopeful afterwards. Through the engagement process, we were really impressed by the level of involvement. My colleague Christian, who is here, helped organize a symposium that we had. We had 1,400 people attending that virtual symposium as part of the development process. But as you say, there's a lot of people who still don't know about it. And so I think our work at Environment and Climate Change Canada will be to continue to promote it. I'll be out at events. We do have social media channels. The ministers will be out presenting about it. So we do want to make sure that people know, because I do think that Canada having a national strategy and working together with partners is something that is hopeful, and it's about actions that people can take. So I think those communications efforts will be really powerful. And fortunately at Environment Canada, we have the weather. So our website is like after the Canada Revenue Agency, or maybe even before it, we have some of the biggest reach out of the federal department. So hopefully that'll get the word out. But we're also, just one other thing I would mention, we're also doing public opinion research. So that was why I was interested in that, is just how we communicate it, because maybe the way we talk about it as a document developed in a certain fashion, and just make sure that we're talking in the language that Canadians can be excited about it and see what it represents. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Okay, looks like we have another question over there. Do we have a mic on that side of the room? And then we'll take a question or two from our virtual audience after this one. Just introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. My name is Manasam Kavela, and come from Manitoba Agriculture. The question that I have is, you mentioned that one of the priorities is climate data. And from what I've seen, Environment Canada is moving away from weather stations, like the number of weather stations has been going down. I don't know whether now you are intending to increase the number of weather stations, because if you are talking about climate data, then you need weather stations. Yeah, so I just want to comment on that. How do you hope to get more climate data?
I feel like I should be offering this question to Heather. So we have the Canadian Centre for Climate Services that is looking at getting climate data out increasingly. I couldn't comment on specifically the increase or decrease of weather stations, but we know that data is tremendously important for decision making and including in an agricultural context. And so it does remain really important for us for investment and to get that data and information out. And so with the regional climate services organizations and with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, investment and reinvestment in those organizations to make the data available, get it into the hands of those who need it to make adaptation decisions is a central kind of plank of the way that we're proposing to advance adaptation action in Canada. So I fortunately can't answer your question about the stations, but I can say that getting data out there and to people who need to take decisions is a key component of our approach.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from our virtual audience that have come in on the Mentimeter? Looking at our team of experts at the back that have 7 laptops between 3 people. Yeah, there's one. Okay, thank you. Okay, so for Lanielle, are there any plans to assist prairie municipalities in accessing the Green Municipal Fund? Per capita, the prairies access less GMF funding than any other region of Canada.
Yeah, you would be surprised, but I'm happy for this question, actually. I think the way that we're going to design the Green Municipal Fund, or the way that we're working with the FCM, the way that it's being designed to help target some of the smaller and rural communities should help us get towards those communities. And so this adaptation stream is going to be a new stream. It's going to be different than some of the others. And so I think we'll have an opportunity to build from the lessons learned of the last 20 years of generally a successful implementation, but really noticing where there's gaps and where people are accessing of it, where the capacity is needed to be able to access it. And so that's why there'll be a stream that can be about developing proposals and getting the support and capacity to develop a proposal that then you can go into a stream to have that proposal funded. So that's kind of the idea that we have. Details, more specific details, we're still working through the different steps that we do internally to get approval on the program approach, and FCM will be doing more in-depth program design. But I am pretty hopeful that the way that we have been initially structuring it is going to increase the reach of it. And in particular, I think I mentioned this, but I'll just underscore, we specifically worked with them, and you'll see in the announcements about this, that it's specifically meant to target a certain number, it's 1,000 small communities. And so it should help us get into the reach of communities that haven't been benefiting from the program in the past. So happy for that question. And I encourage you to take it to FCM as well. I think they probably have thoughts and ideas as well.
And one more question here.
I don't know if it's a question, more like an observation, which you may have something to say about. But when we looked at some of the work, like I was showing earlier, like 0.26% of GDP was shown to be kind of an inadequate investment. $1.9 billion is like 0.001% of Canadian GDP. So it seems really small. So I don't know. It's just an observation.
Yeah, the level of investment will need to increase. I think the government is taking some action and making investments now. I can say that there are additional things that are in mandate letters or that are government public policy statements that will be coming, that will be working in this space. No details that I can share at this time, but I think pretty confident in saying that there are a few more things at least coming down the pipe. But certainly ministers are aware that the level of investment needed and how we reach where we need to be it's a big scale that we need, and the numbers show it, right? That the return on investment makes it worthwhile. So I think I view these in some ways as initial investments, and hopefully more to come. But I think it'll be an important discussion about how we can increase that level of investment needed. Good question.
Okay, well. And we all give Lanielle a thanks here for giving us her presentation.